I would like to thank everyone else for joining as well. Now let me see if I can share my screen with you. And if that goes well. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it's working. Perfect.
Excellent. So please do let me know if I'm going too fast or not. I'm going to try to talk to you a little bit about the things we do with broiler nutrition. Now, there's a lot of detail that you normally go into with these things, especially when you talk about optimization for performance. But what I'm trying to give you is to touch on a few key elements that we see when we look at broiler nutrition and what we need to try and understand in the direction we are going into. Now, the first step is that if we look at broilers, there's quite some similarities like doing a 100-meter sprint. And this is also what you need to keep in mind when you're doing these things. It's not just the nutrition, but also the management point of things. So the real focus that you need in a 100-meter sprint is that proper acceleration out of the blocks. This is where you either make or break what you're going to do. You need to achieve your maximum velocity. So you need to get that growth, and then you need to try and maintain what you're doing there. Now, the most important thing is, and this is also what Usain Bolt says here, is if you do not get a good start, it will be a lot tougher to relax and run your own race from there. And this is the same with broilers. We need to make sure that these birds have an excellent start. So those first 7 days are critical. We put in a lot of effort. But after that point, we get sort of a more easy race to run through. We can just maintain everything that we're doing. So I'm trying to keep this same sort of idea all the way through my presentation. So my first topic that I'll discuss with you will be the starter feed. So basically getting these birds out of the blocks, which is about 60% of the entire race that we're going to do. Then we're going to look at the grower feeds. So we're trying to achieve that maximum growth in the birds that we can get for what we want to see, which is 30% of our race. And then the finisher feed, which is basically maintaining everything that we've set out, which is the final 10%. And then the last part will be to look at, we need to optimize the performance and how do we go. So the first step that we need to do is we need to see how do we plan our race. So if you look here, I've plotted out what basically is the growth curve of that's set in the COP manual. So basically you can see that the first 7 days, the birds are increasing. And then you can see here that we're trying to obtain that maximum velocity and just keep it all going all the way. Now, there's several options how you can look at this. So this is what we give as a standard for the growth curve that we want to see on our birds. Now, there's also options where you can say, I need a little bit more body weight. So you try to get a strong finish in here. And you can see that basically you're trying to start around day 21 is where you're trying to start to get ahead of the curve that you are. But you try to keep that start that you're doing, you try to keep that similar because that is the most important point that you get there. So what you don't want to do is try to get into that race and try to push early on. Because once you start pushing early on, trying to keep this same trend going all the way up here is going to be very difficult. And you can see that most of the times what will happen is you push, and then at some point you'll just start losing that bit there. So we need to make sure that we plan what we're going to do and how we want these birds to grow from start to finish. So conclusions on the starter feed. Okay, we will go through the starter feed by detail, but I want to start with the conclusions here just because I feel that it brings a little bit more to the rest of the topic if we know what we're going to be aiming for. So a poor starter can affect early body weight. And if we do not get our 7-day body weight, we will never get our final body weight. So we need to make sure that we hit that target. And a good starter feed is not just pushing the body weight on these birds. A good starter feed promotes development of a young chick, because this chick goes through a lot of changes in young age. And if we get that development correct, we will see a reduction in final feed conversion. So to give you a little bit of an idea here is, if you look here, all these birds got this, just got a starter feed and went on the same feed afterwards. So we have a control feed, a treatment 1 and a treatment 2. Now, if you look here at day 11, you can see that there is a body weight difference between these birds. And you can see that with treatment 1, these birds did not achieve their good start and their early body weight. And you can see that that really reflects into their final body weight. It doesn't reflect that much into their final feed conversion. Now you can see that the difference between the control and treatment 1 is slightly less. There is some in there. You can see the final body weight is equal of these birds, but you can see just by giving these birds the better start, we were able to get 4 points better feed conversion out of these birds. Now, a lot of people will look at these numbers and say, okay, basically what you've done here is you've given these birds a lower density diet, the other birds a higher density diet, so it's all down to that point. Well, it's not really that, because a lot of people will say, I cannot get a good 7-day body weight, so the density of my feed needs to be increased. Well, if you look at what the numbers do, and I've taken just lysine here as a goal, we've done 1% and we've done 1.2%. So this is the carb recommendation, and we've just stepped it down. Our day 0 body weights are similar. So this is a good start. But if we look at day 4, you can see that on day 4, our body weights are still the same. And they are matching the carb standard exactly. Now, at day 11, that's where you can see that there is a difference. You can see that the birds that got the feed managed to get that standard, but you can see that even though we've made a very large reduction in our density here, we were still able to achieve a very decent body weight on these birds on day 11. So this just shows you that with feed, with nutrition, in the starter feed, you can really try to see that we can get the development correct, but you need to apply those brooding principles that have been that were spoken about in the last 2 days, because that's really what you can see here on day 4. That's what drives your development, to get all those things correct, and you can get it there more easily. Now, if we look at the birds and we really start to look at how do we push these birds and how do we get an optimal performance out of the birds and get them out of the start correctly, what we've done is we've looked at different levels of lysine, and we've just tried to see how does this bird respond in terms of body weight gain. So this is from day 1 to day 14, and you can see that the moment we start increasing our lysine, you can see that our body weight trends up, but you can also see that there is a point here where this starts to curve down again, so that we do not get the more. So if we feed them more, we do not get the same gain out of there. Now, if we look with the same lysine levels and we start looking at the feed conversion, this is where you can see that the feed conversion, the more we increase our lysine, the lower our feed conversion goes. But you can see here as well that that line trends to go down, but you can see that it is starting to plateau at one point. Now, there's of course a lot of economics and everything else that comes into play with these things, but it just shows you that there's different reactions within these birds. And this is similar when we look at things like energy. So we've taken 4 energy levels in the birds, and we've just looked at how does this bird respond. And you can see that the body weight gain of these birds is equal. The feed intake of these birds is also equal. And you can see here that the feed conversion therefore is also the same. So that gives you an idea that these birds at a young age do not just respond to energy. It's not just simple, put more energy in there and these birds will go. Now, if you look at the amino acid levels, we've done 100% of the carb recommendation and 92% of the carb recommendation. Here you can see that the body weight gain is going down. So this is at day 14. So you can see that we got a little bit less body weight gain. We get the same feed intake, but because of the body weight gain, we get a different feed conversion. Now, if you look here, this is a very important point because these young chicks, they can only consume a certain amount of feed. So they're not like an older broiler who can compensate to get a little bit more feed intake, to compensate for what's in the feed. These birds need a little bit more stricter diet to make sure that with the feed intake that they can get, that they get all the nutrients that they need. So if we look at the trends that we see in the world when we talk about starter feed, the main points that we see is that there's more and more of a reduction of energy because we see that these birds don't respond to energy as a whole, as you just saying. And then we start to increase our amino acid density more and more because we're focusing on getting these birds heavy body weights and we want a lower feed conversion. But it's sort of similar to trying to strap the chick to a rocket and just trying to push it all the way through. Sometimes it works, but not always. And this is where we get into the point that the results that we get when we go in this direction is we get unpredictable performance. So we get great flocks out there that we say, you know, this is what we're doing is good. But at the same time, we're getting flocks that have very poor performance and we see increased mortality. And more importantly, we also see an increase in cost coming from there. So within Cal, we've taken a slightly different route with what we want to see in our starter feed. So we've taken not just energy, but we're starting to really look at what type of energy do these birds need for development. So we've looked at the two main points. So the first one is fat and the second one is carbohydrates. So what we see is just as an internal development, if we give these birds more fat, we can see that the liver weight goes down and the weight of the intestines goes up. Now, if we give these birds more carbohydrates, we see that the liver weight tends to go up and the weight of the gut tends to go down. So this gives you an idea that just by changing our energy source, we are changing how this chick develops. Now, to come back to the conclusion that I had earlier, I showed you the treatment 1 and treatment 2. And this is basically those two treatments. So we've done a feed where we've really focused on getting these birds all the energy that they need out of carbohydrates. And we've given them a feed which really focused on getting all their energy out of fat. Now, if you think of this out of a logic point of view, when a chick is still inside the egg and it's using the yolk to develop, the yolk is for the majority of the part, the energy is fat. So there is a little bit of reason behind the fact that these birds, when you give them more energy from fat, that they do tend to have a better development and that it can just continue all the way through. So what are we trying to do when we look at energy into these feeds, into these starter feeds? So basically, if I just go back here, you can see that these body weights are very different. So what we are trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we are activating the right genes, the right parts of these birds when we give them the first feed. So what we don't want is we don't want to see any metabolic syndromes come up. So we don't want to see anything like that we're messing up the lipid metabolism of these birds, or that we're changing something in the glucose tolerance, or that we're giving these birds a stress response. Now, there have been some links when we talk about metabolic syndromes, because talking about these things in chickens is very difficult to classify these things, and there's not that much research around it. So there is some points where we can try to find some overlap with ourselves. So one of the things that we found is that once we see some metabolic syndromes in these birds, that there is a type 2 diabetes overlap with people. Now, I'm not saying that our birds have diabetes, because in a chicken, it's not the same process as it is in a human. So we respond very well to glucose when we talk about things like diabetes, so sugar and everything else, where chickens respond to glucagon, which is a different route to go into. So the bird responds differently, but it shows a sort of an overlap that's in there in the way that these birds respond. Now, when we talk about metabolic disorders, I think the main point that we need to focus on is that we see things like ectopic lipid deposition. So difficult word, what basically means is that we're saying we're getting more fat in the bird than what we actually would like to see. So these birds start to put down a lot more fat in the abdominal cavity and around the skin. We tend to see some oxidative stress and a lot of other things like here. And what we basically end up with is low performance and high mortality. So what should we focus on when we look at these things? So we need to try to provide the right nutrients for development in these birds. So not just push the body weight, but really get the development and make sure that what we're doing gives us a correct idea. Now, to make a little bit of an example out of this, I know that in South Africa, you like your braai, and I know that once you get closer to the places like Durban, there's very great places to eat curry. Now imagine for yourself that you guys are approaching the summer, so you're having a lot of braais and you're doing that for 2 weeks straight. And after those 2 weeks, you say, you know what, I'm really craving a little bit of curry, and you're changing your diet just suddenly to curry. Some of us can deal with it, but I think the majority of us will feel that after the day of curry that it is much better to stay close to home. So this is the same for our chicks. We want to make sure that we're avoiding any metabolic disturbances. So we want to make sure that we're supplying these chicks with what they need, and that we get a good point of development in there, and that we activate the right genes in these birds, and that we start to support the development of the supply organs so that we get a good heart development. The intestines need to develop correctly, and then we get the right metabolic processes to start in these birds. Because what we've seen is if we put these birds on carbohydrates, you do not get the same start out of these birds as when you put them on a more fat and more balanced diet. So the goal is we want to get that bird out of the blocks correctly as the healthy chick, and we want to make sure that we try to achieve our 190 to 200 grams 7-day body weight on these birds. So how do we do that? We need to make sure that we get the balance between energy and amino acids correctly. So pushing more on the amino acids means that these birds will just get more body weight. Not development, but more body weight, which may bite us in the end. Then we need to make sure that we get the correct form of energy. So not just that we say, okay, we can reduce energy, but we need the correct form of energy, so not just the value. And then we need to make sure, the same for us, that we need to supply these birds with some form of fiber, that we get a good activation of gut, that we get a little bit more working in there. We need to balance our microminerals, and we need to use good quality ingredients. Now, when we talk about good quality ingredients, I just want to make a small sidestep on that point, because good quality ingredients doesn't mean that you cannot use alternative ingredients. You cannot look outside of the box that we are already normally operating with. So a common belief that's within the industry is that a young chick is not able to deal with a very high amount of alternative ingredients. So we need to supply these birds with the best corn that we can get and the best soybean meal that we can get. And we need to keep it a very simple and easy diet. Now, we've done a few trials where we've looked at these, and we've basically said, you know, we want to try to get more alternative ingredients and see how the bird responds. So we went for a soya-free diet, which means we really need to get alternative protein sources for these birds. And we've just used our control as a normal feed. Now, what you can see here is our 7-day body weight was slightly higher, maybe, I would say equal, but slightly higher. We got a good feed conversion, and we didn't see any issues with mortality. Now, if we talk about what alternative ingredients, you're really looking at things like peas, sunflower, rapeseed, lupines, really very different ingredients to what you compare your soybean meal to. But it just shows that if you make sure that your feed is a correct formulation, and you get a good quality ingredient, that you can actually go in very different directions and still achieve the target that you would like to see. So that's it basically for the starter feed. Now we've gotten our chicks out of the block, and we're getting to that point where we want to be, and then we get to that difficult transition period. So going from a starter feed to a grower feed is very difficult, because we get these chicks going from being a really small chick to becoming a broiler at these points. And also we can see that, you know, we've made that first initial start, and we can see that those birds, the acceleration of body weight starts to come in. So we're trying to start to attain our maximum velocity, our maximum growth in there. So the needs of these birds really change more drastically with the body weight coming on these birds. And then also we get the question, so when do we transition? So do we do it early? Do we do it later? What do we need to do? And how do we balance everything to maintain that to get to that maximum velocity? So the first step there is to reevaluate our energy points again. So, oh, I do apologize, but it says here body weight gain, in case it's a little bit more difficult to read. So what we've done is we've just taken 4 different energy levels just to see how does the bird respond in terms of body weight. And what you can see here is that basically you can see that a lower energy level, the birds don't get the gain, but at a certain point you can see that we can almost draw a line here that this is almost equal. So the COB recommendation for the age of 14 to 28 is sort of dead in the middle here. So there may be a little bit that we can move more into this direction, but it seems that we are very close there to what the recommendation is. Now, if we do the same, but we also look at lysine at the same time here. So we've gotten our energy levels, but we also put some lysine next to this, and we start looking at our feed conversion. We can actually see that if we take the top line here first, which is the lower energy level, you can see that when we add more lysine into it, we get a small response. And then once we push more, we get a bigger response. But you can see that with increasing our energy here, our feed conversion tends to go down. But I think the best example is the one we find here is at 3000 energy, is that when we push more lysine into these birds, we don't get the same response. So we need the energy for these birds also to be in there, that these birds can really utilize what we're providing them. And this also brings me to the point that the COB recommendation is at 1.05. So it's sort of on this side. So if we combine these 2 factors, that would mean that the COB recommendation is roughly on this point on the orange line. So we feel that we're close there as well, that we are getting the best gain out of what we would like to see there. Now, then we always have to make a very difficult choice. So that's the reason why I'm showing these graphs here, is we've looked at the same lysine again, and we've looked at a much more varying level, but we've split our birds up into males and females. And we've looked at the body weight gain. Now, what you can see here is that the females, if we look at the body weight gain, the females need a lot more lysine before they really plateau on their body weight gain. And if we compare that to the males, you can see it goes up much steeper, but it plateaus much quicker. So for the males, it would be somewhere, well, let's keep it easy, and let's say the 1% here. And for the females, you can see that it's much more in the 1.15 range. So you can see here that we are trying to manage these birds all as one. But you can see that between the males and the females, there is a very different response than what we get in there. And the same goes when we look at feed conversion. But actually what you see there is we're actually flipping the chart around, because you can see that the females feed conversion goes down until 1.10, and then it plateaus. Whereas for the males, you can see that everything keeps trending downwards up to the 1.2, and from there on it plateaus. So it's very difficult to start managing these birds as one if you just see that these 2 responses are so different. And then if we want to make it even more difficult, we start adding yield into this equation. And you can see that for the females, if we push more lysine into it, you can see that at 1.2, so close to what it was for the feed conversion there, you can see it plateaus. But if we then take a look at males, you can basically see that the males have a linear response, and we haven't even reached a plateau level on these birds. So it just shows you that if we're trying to optimize our performance and we're trying to get the maximum velocity out of these birds, we already need to start making a lot of compromises, because we need to look at these things not just as saying we want the best, we want the most, but we also want it to be balanced. So if we then just make it as a summary and we look at this, we would say that for body weight gain, it would be around 1.06% lysine is where you need to be. So this is close to the COP recommendation. Now, if you want to push something more on feed conversion, you can really step it up there. But a step up like this comes at a relatively high cost. And the same if we look at yield, you can push it even more and you can get more yield out of those birds, but that also comes at a significant cost that's in there. And I will come back to the cost factors of this a little bit later on in the presentation. Now, the next step to really look at when we talk about these things, and in the starter feed, we need to look at the same things, but in the grower feed, it's much easier to do these trials. So that's why I'm showing this here. So what we need to do is we need to imagine that this is actually, well, I'm trying to ask a lot of your imagination, but this is a chicken. And you can see that all these planks that are on here are the amino acids that we're providing these birds. Now, what we are trying to do is we are trying to make sure that we find the limiting amino acids. So when we talk about limiting amino acids, we want to look at which one of these blocks is limiting the growth of our birds. So which one, if we push it slightly up, we get more performance out of these birds. And looking at this in a barrel theory makes it easier to see and to comprehend this. So we always talk about everything in terms of lysine. So what you can see here is that lysine and threonine are equal, and we cannot fill this barrel, this chicken, any more than what these 2 points provide us. Now what we can do is we can provide some synthetic amino acids, and we can actually say we're putting in more threonine, we're putting in a little bit more lysine, which means we're actually upping everything up, and we're putting it equal to tryptophan here. But that means that we're actually, just by increasing these two, we can fill our barrel with a lot more water. So we can get a lot more performance out of our chicken. And then we can do the same. We can just keep going around this circle until we've tried to get the most out of everything. So we want to make sure that we're not oversupplying some of these things, because oversupplying is also not a good thing. So we want to make sure that we're trying to balance these things out correctly. Now, to give you a little bit of an idea of how we can do this. So it's a very, there's a lot of numbers on this table, and I don't want you to look at everything. I just want you to grasp a little bit of the concept of the way we do this. So what we do is we take here what we call the positive control, which is basically the recommendation that we currently have. And then we put a negative control next to it. The negative control is where we start to take all our synthetic amino acids out of the feed. So we basically supply these birds with just the amino acids that they can get out of soybean meal and maize. So we see that our body weight goes down, and we can see that our feed conversion goes up. Now, the next thing that we do is we make a similar feed to our positive control, but we do this with more synthetic amino acids. And then we start taking every single feed as a different amino acids taken out. So if we take valine here as an example, so this feed is almost the same as our positive control, but we didn't add valine into this diet. So that is our limiting board on that barrel. We've reduced valine. So we want to see to what level can we fill this barrel until we hit our valine point. And you can see here that our body weight has decreased quite drastically, but our feed conversion, it's slightly higher, but it's still quite equal. But this gives you an idea of how we need to approach these things and how we need to look at this. And then we need to do the same for all the amino acids and then start moving forward and backwards. So this gives us an idea that valine in this grower feed would be that first limiting board that we need to look into. Because if we put just isoleucine next to it, you can see that with isoleucine, we actually get more body weight numerically, and we get a lower feed conversion. So this gives us an interesting point. And by looking at these two, I want to take it into the next step. Now, I'm just want to show you what we're doing here and just showing the complexity of things, and to already give you the conclusion. Sometimes we find something which we think works, but once we really do it, it doesn't work that way. So what we do is we take a three-dimensional model, and basically here you have your control point, and from there you start going into different directions with your amino acid levels. Now this allows us to also create three-dimensional models of the response of our birds. And what you can see here is that you can see that basically what you would like to do is in a model like this is for body weight gain. Please don't look at the numbers or anything else, but you want to achieve that you want to get to the lowest point on this graph that you can actually get to. And if you remember in the previous table, you saw that we talked about valine and isoleucine. So we've done the same isoleucine and valine here, and we thought that we found some good numbers. Now again, I'm showing this table here completely, but we're going to focus on just 2 points. So based on the data that we have, we know that this should be our valine level. Now, what we saw out of the other one is that we saw an interaction with isoleucine. So what we've done is we've basically taken what we've learned out of our previous study and we've implemented that. Now, if we look here, this treatment should have been the very best growth and feed conversion that we could get out of our birds based on our previous trials. But you can see here that compared to our control, we didn't achieve what we needed. And even if we compare it to just the valine levels, we also didn't achieve what we wanted to get to. And you can see just by looking at the values here that everything is the same. So that just shows you that even though you're doing these trials on an individual basis and you're finding these points where we can tweak the bird, once you put things into practice, it may not be the same thing. So then to look at these a little bit more practical, because going into all these depth with the amino acids, I mean, I think we can keep studying this for the next 15 years and we still won't have all the answers that we need. But the things that we can control and which gives us a little bit more ease is we need to make sure that we plan our race. So we need to plan when are we transitioning from getting that maximum velocity to maintaining our things. And the period that we have this grower feed is from, well, let's say day 10 to 28. And this is filled with a lot of challenges. I mean, the veterinarians are putting a lot of vaccinations in there, but we're also getting a cocci challenge that runs besides this. And while all these challenges are there, we are still trying to gain our maximum velocity and we are trying to maintain it as well at the same time. So we need to make sure that we understand what's going on in our field, in our region. So we really need to make sure that we understand the challenges in our own field, in our own local environment, because sometimes the weather changes just make it difficult, or there's something else in there. We need to make sure that we know when we're going to transition in our race to get to where we need to be. So, you know, there's a few points that we always say that are the don'ts. So we don't want to change feed 2 days before or 2 days after vaccination, because you're already giving these birds the vaccination. So you're stressing that immune system. You're asking a lot of that bird in the response. So if you also make a feed change at that same time, you're putting a second pressure onto that bird that it doesn't need. And also we try to avoid a transition between day 24 to day 28. Now I would like every one of you to look at your data once you have an opportunity to do that, and just look at feed intakes in that period. Look at your water intake in that period. And what you'll see is that almost every single flock you will find between day 24 to day 28, there will be a slight dip in the feed intake of these birds or in the water intake of these birds. And mainly this coincides with somewhat of a cocci or a health challenge on these birds. And that's where you also want to avoid that you don't make a change in that same period when these birds are already being challenged slightly there. So you need to make sure that you're planning your transition correctly. So the main conclusion that we see in the grower feed is that we need to get the right balance between energy and amino acids. And we need to make sure that it fits our regional growth rate. So we can say, you know, it works here, but it may not work there. And we need to make sure that everything is fitted to body weight and age. So we get the right goal where we need to do. So again, avoid transitions in that difficult time period. And then we always need to look at, do we want 1 grower feed, 2 grower feeds, or this all needs to look at how are you doing your race and how are you planning this out. So with the grower feed finished, we're finally getting into that last bit. So we're looking at everything we've set these birds up to. We want to make sure that they can maintain what we've done there. So once we get into that finisher phase, there's so many changes again into these birds, because you have a really, well, compared to that small chick of 200 grams, you're looking at a broiler of 2 kilos. So there's differences in the things like heat production of these birds. So that's where all the ventilation, everything else that Brendan and Nigel and Andrew spoke about, that's really the focus there. We need to make sure that we give these birds enough energy to maintain their body weight, because we cannot just say, we've grown you to this level, now maintain yourself. We need to make sure that we give these birds the energy to maintain it, but also to keep growing. And now just to give a little bit of an idea of how much we're actually providing these birds. So if we look at these birds just from day 28 to day 34, the bird eats around 1 kg of feed. So that's around 3,200 kilocalories. So a bird would eat around 6 Big Macs. But if we would translate this to ourselves in that same time period, we would eat 20 kilos of finisher feed, but we would take in 128,000 kilocalories. So that's 251 Big Macs. Now just imagine how much you would need to eat on a single day to get to that same point. So these birds really are athletes, and they're really, we need to make sure that in that last bit of that race, we give them what they need. So if we look at this, and we look at the energy levels of these birds, and we look at the percentage of body weight, and we start looking at what are we changing in these birds if we give them more energy. So if we look at protein, so if we give these birds more energy, they start to put down a little bit more protein into the body, so we get more muscle development out of these birds. But you can see that there's a limiting level, so we're going on the low side, and there's a plateau here. So there's a delicate line that we're walking on there. And the same if we look at terms of energy in the body. So energy in the body is mainly driven by fat, but what you can see that once we start increasing our energy, we increase the energy in the body, so we increase the amount of fat that these birds have in their body as well. So we need to balance this out, that we get the most out of our protein in here, but we don't push the fat development on these birds. The same goes when we look at amino acids. If we go from 80% of the COP recommendation to 120% of the COP recommendation, you can see that we're pushing slightly more on the protein that's coming into these birds, but you can see we're going from 16% protein to 70% protein, and that's from pushing in a lot more amino acids into these birds. But the one thing we do get is what we see is we really reduce the amount of fat in these birds. So what we see when we drive these amino acids in the final pit, we're really driving our feed conversion ratio more than anything else. So what we see with these finisher feeds is that balance between energy and amino acids, we need to get that right, that we don't get these birds, that we don't get these birds to plateau here, but we're on this edge, so we're really approaching the plateau, but not too much. And the same with the amino acids, that we get into a spot where we say, this is where we want our birds to be. And that brings me to the final point where everything sort of comes together, ties in, is when we try to optimize our performance, we need to look at what really is our goal. And this is such a difficult question, because do we want to see the lowest feed conversion? Do we want to see the highest average daily gain? Do we want the highest EPF, or the lowest cost per broiler, or the lowest cost per kg live weight? Or do we want the lowest cost per kilogram of meat? So this really gives you an idea of what is our goal. And this needs to be set as a company, but also as a region, because you need to look at what are my growth profiles, what can I achieve, and how can I do this? But we've done a trial where we've done just different densities of feed. So we went with medium density, which is the COP feed. We increased our density and we went a little bit lower. And we've done this all the way through, so from start to finish. So if you look, our cost per bird increases. So also our cost per kg of bird increases. But you can see that increase between the low density and medium is slightly less compared to the other one. So you can see that there's some some gradient in there. And then we start looking at the profit. So if we look at a profit on live weight, you can see here that on the low density feed, you get the most profit out of a live weight bird, because the only thing you're not looking at meat there, you're just looking at the body weight. But if we start looking at the profit on a carcass point of view, you can see that it does value to put in that higher density. And the same if you start putting into things in the terms of the fillet. So if you're really focusing on that, there you can see that the value is in there. But then you need to start balancing out everything, the cost, and this is just one example. And things can change within a month or within a week. So you need to keep this fluid and keep this going. And the nutritional approach that you're going to take really needs to depend on what your goal is. So you need to make sure that you understand correctly, what is my aim at the end of this race? Is it lowest cost per kg live weight, lowest cost per kilogram of fillet? Do I want to get to a certain body weight? So if we look at the things that I really want you to take home, is you need to make sure that you're planning your sprint correctly. So you need to know where you want to be at each step and how you're going to achieve the points where you want to go to. We need to make sure that we provide a quality starter feed so that we get good early development. So not just body weight, but a good early development on these birds so that we get everything back in the final bit. We need to balance our grower to our target so that we make sure that when we look at our growth curve, that we know that we're keeping to that curve and we're keeping to where we want these birds to be. And with the finisher feed, the main goal that we need is that we get the most out of the protein we're supplying these birds. So we want to make sure that the energy we're giving these birds is enough for maintenance and just enough for growth, but we're not oversupplying them that they don't get fat. And we really need to make sure that we know what our goal is. What are we trying to achieve? And with that, I would really like to thank you for your attention this morning. I hope I didn't go too fast or anything else, but if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask them.